Greetings! I'm speaking to you in the winter of 1964, of 2024. 2024, the winter. Now, the reason why I was thinking 19 is because this is the 60th anniversary of Fiddler on the Roof. So evidently, 1964, right, is when it came out. And the musical was a great hit on Broadway and then became a film. And it's based upon the writing of the famous Yiddish author Sholem Aleichem. He wrote something about Tevye the Dairyman. And so, it became a Yiddish movie in the 1930s, and then a musical play, and then finally a film that was quite successful, and many of you have probably seen. And in that movie, there's some comments that Tevye makes in prayer that maybe some of you still remember. For example, he's not all that well-to-do, and so he says to God, I realize it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either. Mm-hmm. And then he also hears about the fact ahead of time there's going to be an anti-Semitic riot in his hometown in the Ukraine. There's going to be a pogrom, an anti-Semitic riot. And so he goes to God and says, I realize, of course, that we're the chosen people, but once in a while, couldn't you choose someone else? Anyway, there's a song that came out of that musical called Wonder of Wonders, Miracle of Miracles, and that's the title of today's talk. Wonder of Wonders, Miracle of Miracles. But I do want to clarify something from last week. Last week I spoke about the importance of keeping the appointed times of God that we see in Leviticus 23. And the next season coming up as I speak is the Passover season, because I'm in the winter of 2024. And I want to go to chapter 30, verse 20 of 2 Chronicles. And here is the Passover of Hezekiah. So there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon and the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. Why? I think it has to. I don't think I explained it properly last week. I think what happened was, that the kingdom had split, and some had fled south, but those who remained in the north were not coming to Jerusalem for the feast. But now that the Assyrians had conquered Israel, but there were still Israelites living in the north that hadn't yet been taken away, and some of them did come south to keep the feast and then go back, and carried with them a certain amount of positive influence. So this, in a way, was recapturing some of the spirit of the time when Israel and Judah unitedly kept the festival. So I think that was the point there. We have an even more dramatic statement regarding Josiah. Now, by the time of Josiah, the 10 tribes are gone, and now we don't really have Israel to the north. We have the Samaritans to the north. So the remnant of Israel is in the south in Judah, and the Jews come together with in various other. They're known now as the Jews, even though they're a mixture of the various tribes, but Judah is dominant. And so they're in the south, in the kingdom of Judah, and they're keeping the Passover under Josiah. And it says in verse 18 of 2 Chronicles 35, there had been no Passover kept in Israel like that since the days of Samuel the prophet, and none of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as Josiah kept, with the priests and the Levites, all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And I think the point here is, it's unique in the sense that of the group that was there, that was living there, the people of Israel, the remnant, the percentage of participation was perhaps the highest it had ever been. That may be what's going on there. I'm speculating. So if you didn't catch that talk from last week, it's available. I think I'm trying to remember when will they ever learn is what I called it. God's people, of course, need to learn to respect His appointed times. Today I want to talk about the resurrections you see in the Bible to remind us that God does have the power to do that, and He intends to do it, and there's an entire plan of salvation based upon the resurrection, and there's more than one resurrection, and we can read about the resurrections. First, there's a basic doctrine in the book of Hebrews in the 6th chapter. It's a basic doctrine of Judaism, a basic doctrine of Christianity, a basic doctrine of Islam. a basic doctrine of the Abrahamic religions, the resurrection. And in the Techiyat HaMetim, reviving the dead in the Hebrew, or anastase in the Greek. We get the name Anastasia in English. To stand again, and so that's where resurrection comes from in Latin, to stand again. Resurrection. And in the book of Revelation, the 20th chapter, we see references to more than one revelation. More than one resurrection. And we also have in the book of Daniel, in the 12th chapter, a reference to more than one resurrection. So there is a whole plan of salvation involving the doctrine of the resurrection. And I'm not going to fully, of course, expound on that today. But as we keep the appointed times of God, these observances remind us of His plan of salvation, and they keep us remembering and understanding how God is proceeding, and ultimately He will be quite successful in what He intends to do, because He is God, and He knows what He's doing. But I want to talk today about resurrections you read in the Bible as an encouragement, and to show you that what God is capable of doing and what He intends to do. So the first resurrection that I want to talk about is somewhat problematic, because not everybody fully agrees with what's going on. But that's in 1 Samuel 28. And it seems there that God has intervened in a miraculous way to bring Samuel up as a spirit being, as he will be when Christ returns, as a final condemnation of Saul, a final, I'm trying to think of the right word, reaffirmation of the importance of the Davidic dynasty, and so we have that the final word from Samuel. But that was a brief moment in history. He's dead, and ultimately he will be raised to immortality at the coming of Jesus Christ, along with the other saints. And if I have time, I'll read verses about it, or God willing, as I continue to preach over the years, I'll be reading verses about that. But then we have some other examples that are simpler to explain, simply of somebody who was dead and brought back to physical life and lived on for a while. We don't know how long. We have 1 Kings 17. Elijah the prophet prays for the son of a widow, and that son comes back to life. And then we have, in the case of Elisha, as the Americans would pronounce his name, the disciple of Elijah, and he prays. First of all, through his prayers, an elderly couple is given a son. Then when the son dies, through his prayers, that son is resurrected. And then we have a rather fascinating situation in 2 Kings 13. And I don't think all of you are aware of this passage. And if you are, fine. I'll remind you of it. It might have been a while since you read it. It's in 2 Kings 13, and I want to go to verse 20. Then Elisha died, and they buried him. And the raiding bands from Moab invaded the land in the spring of the year. So it was, as they were burying a man, that suddenly they spied a band of raiders, and they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. And when the man was let down, touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. So it's an amazing account here. And so this is yet another case of a person who was dead, brought back to life. How long he lived, I don't know. It seems to me he was in the middle of a war zone, but he was brought back to life. So these are cases in the Old Testament where God does that through the prophets. And in the New Testament, he does it through the apostles, and also, of course, himself as he comes as Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ performs some resurrections, and we'll deal with those. In fact, I'm going to go right to the case of the widow of Nain. I want to go to Luke, the 7th chapter, and we're now in the Galilee region, in the town of Nain, and there's a widow who has a son, and he dies, and that of course puts her in a very very serious position there, very vulnerable position. But I want to just jump in verse 13 of Luke 7, when there's a funeral procession. Jesus sees it. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. Then fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet is risen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him went throughout all Judea, and all the surrounding region. So now the biblical land of Israel is aroused by this by this miracle. And this, of course, helps Jesus Christ's ministry. But at the same time, he's careful. He doesn't want to go too far because he doesn't want things to come to a head too soon. His martyrdom is going to happen, but he's planning it out. He has a 3.5-year ministry. And so the second time he does something like this, he doesn't do it in such a public way. I want to go to now the 8th chapter of Luke. And here we have a situation where Jairus, if you read in verse 41, Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, comes to him, and his daughter is sick. But later on, Jesus performs a miracle and heals a woman. And in the meantime, in verse 49, while he was still speaking, someone came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying to him, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher." But when Jesus heard it, he answered, saying, "Do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be made well." Quite a statement. When he came into the house, he permitted no one to go in except Peter, James, and John, and the father and mother of the girl. Now all wept and mourned for her, but he said, "Do not weep. She's not dead, but sleeping." So from his point of view, this was temporary. So it was like sleeping because it was temporary. She was going to wake up. So death is referred to as a sleep for those who are going to be resurrected. And they ridiculed him, knowing that she was dead. Then he put them all outside, took her by the hand, and called, saying, "Little girl, arise." Then her spirit returned, and she arose immediately, and he commanded that she be given something to eat. In other words, she's still a regular flesh and blood human. She's been brought back to life, but now she has to do what people do. She has to eat and sleep and, live her life. She has to go back to normal. And her parents were astonished, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. So in this case, he didn't make a big public spectacle. Perhaps, as I said, he felt like, okay, I've got enough publicity for the time being. I don't want things to come to a head too soon. But you have these examples. And then I want to go to the most dramatic example later on. And I'll see how much time I have to go into it. Where literally a person is dead for several days. And, there's no question that the person was dead. And Jesus brings him back to life. And that's, of course, the example of Lazarus. And I want to go back to that. But before I do, I want to show you something that happened when Jesus died that a lot of people, I think, are not so aware of. And that's in Matthew 27. Jesus has been crucified. And, of course, things begin to happen, symbolic of his ministry and what he accomplished, what his death accomplished. And, of course, he's resurrected. He's our living Savior. But he needed to suffer and die for us. But in verse 52, after he died, then behold, this is Matthew 27:52, then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split. And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And I assume recently dead people who were known as righteous people, and some maybe his disciples, were resurrected. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into this holy city and appeared to many. Well, this would have certainly stirred up a lot of excitement, and it probably helped to jumpstart the church later on when you read in the book of Acts how that dramatic beginning to the church this would have obviously been a factor, I would say. And that's something, as I said, that many, I'm not sure that they're quite aware of that. But again, these people were raised through physical life, so they died eventually. But it just shows you what God can do, what he plans to do. And now I want to go to the book of Acts, to the 9th chapter. And here we have now two great apostles. You know, Peter focuses on those descended from Israel, and Paul focuses on the Gentiles. And in Acts 9 and verse 36, we see that Tabitha, or Dorcas, she, many Jews have two names. I'm Mark, David, and Hebrew, Meir, David. And so in her case, she's Tabitha and Dorcas. But Peter, I'll go in verse 39. They call him. Evidently, they believe that he can bring her back to life because they called him to come when she died. Then Peter, and I'm going on verse 39 now. Then Peter arose and went with them. When he had come, they brought him to the upper room, and all the widows stood by him. So there were people, she was a important member of the church. She was a pillar of the church. And they were weeping, showing the tunics and garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them. But Peter put them all out and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And then she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. Then he gave her his hand and lifted her up, and when he had called the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, the city of Jaffa, the Tel Aviv area today, and many believed on the Lord. So this was, again, a way to promote Peter's ministry. God did many miracles early in the days of the church as it was beginning, in effect, to jumpstart the church. And so it was that he stayed many days in Joppa with Simon, a tanner. I imagine he had a lot of work to do as a minister, and bringing in new members of the church, or explaining the teachings of Jesus Christ to people. This account of what happened would have been a way of stirring up a lot of interest. Now we have an example in Acts 20 that's interesting, and it reminds me of my experience in the world of ultra-Orthodox Judaism. We used to get together on Saturday night to say goodbye to the Sabbath. We called the Sabbath a queen, and we would accompany the queen out. Melave Malka, it was called, accompanying the queen. And we would get together, we men, and we would sing and eat, and then the rabbi would teach us, and this was a way of beginning the new week. So maybe that was happening here. Maybe they were beginning the new week, and maybe it was a Saturday night meeting. The reason I would speculate it was a Saturday night meeting is because Paul spoke until midnight. So, at least that's reasonable, that it might have started in the evening, beginning of the first day of the week, and went on till midnight. All right? In any case, a younger man probably had, got sleepy after a while, but he was high up and he fell and he died. Could you imagine this? What a horrible thing to happen at such an occasion. But in verse 10, but Paul went down, this is of course Eutychus, but Paul went down, fell on him, and embracing him said, do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him. So Paul brought him back to life. God did, but through Paul. Now when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till daybreak, he departed. So he kept on going. And then he left the next day, which was very likely Sunday morning, but I can't guarantee that. But as he visits areas, he gathers the people together when he can, and so maybe he started Sunday morning, went all the way to the next morning. I can't be dogmatic about it, but anyway, in verse 12, then they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted. This is an interesting statement by Luke. It kind of reminds me of the style of the British. Kind of understatement. And they were not a little comforted, I would think so. So here you have examples of a resurrection through Peter and a resurrection through Paul. And we also have that resurrection of saints that occurs. These are all people brought back to physical life, not to immortality, but just showing God's capacity to do even that kind of a miracle if he so chooses, and for his reasons, and as I said, it would seem in some cases there were very important reasons at that time in history for him to do what he did in terms of resurrection. I want to now go back to John 11, to that account, and as I have time, because it's really moving. We have the fact that Lazarus, well, let's go to verse 11. Let's go to John 11. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Now he's referring to an event, I believe, that you read about in the next chapter, 12 and verse 3. I believe he's referring to that. So he kind of, clues you in that this is the Mary that did that, which you're going to read later on. That's my take on it. And let me just make sure that I'm giving you the right reference. Yes. Okay, now I want to continue on. You have these two sisters, but therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. So he was somebody that Jesus knew, a friend, close friend. When Jesus heard that, he said, the sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, and that the Son of God may be glorified through it. See, now we're at the point where he's about to be martyred. This is, in John 12, he enters Jerusalem. So now he does a tremendous miracle that, of course, ought to show people who he is. But at the same time, it causes other people to want to plot to get rid of him. Incredibly enough, as you keep reading. But anyway, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. So he actually waited long enough, because he was going to resurrect him from the dead. He wasn't going to heal him of the sickness. He was going to allow him to die and then resurrect him from the dead. And of course, in doing so, he was going to Judea, which was dangerous. It certainly was, because he was going to be martyred afterwards. His disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? And then, anyway, I don't want to go through the whole account, but verse 14, I'll go down to verse 14. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. This was like a final great miracle he was going to perform before his own resurrection. So I can continue on here, and I'm going to go to verse 25 of chapter 11 of John, because this miracle he performs is to show who Jesus Christ is, and frankly, for us to be looking forward to that better resurrection, as it's called in the Bible, the first resurrection, as it's called in the Bible. For us to look forward to that, we need to have a right relationship to God through Jesus Christ. There is no other way. Verse 25, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? So I think what he means by that is he shall never die in this permanent sense. His death will be just temporary, because he will be resurrected to immortal life, he or she. She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. I'll jump to, he's very frustrated, if you keep reading, at their lack of faith. It even brings him to tears. The shortest verse in the Bible, 11:33, Jesus wept. The longest verse is in Esther, the 8th chapter, and God willing, many of us will be reading that as Purim is coming in a couple of months. But anyway, I want to go to verse 38. Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, he's very frustrated at their lack of faith or their lack of understanding. In some cases they had faith, but they didn't really understand how much power Jesus had. Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Then he took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." Now when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go." Now notice what happens next. Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs." And we know the rest of the story. This brought about a plot to get rid of him. So it's amazing, but this was all part of God's plan. This accomplished two things in a way. It got the leadership so aroused as to plot his eventual martyrdom, and it also got many to believe in him. But I recommend you read the entire account. I just read parts of it. But so here again we have an example of Christ resurrecting somebody to physical life. So we had, I think, 3 cases where he did that that are recorded. Jairus's daughter, right, and the son of the widow of Nain, and then we have Lazarus, which is the most dramatic because he didn't just die; he was dead for 4 days, buried, wrapped up, and out he comes. Here we have in the Bible examples where God has intervened and brought people back to life, not eternal life. That only happened once in the case of Jesus Christ. He was resurrected to immortal life. And I want to go to 1 Corinthians 15 and mention that. He is the antitype of the wave sheaf offering. And the wave sheaf offering pictures the risen Christ, just as the Paschal lamb sacrifice pictures the crucified Christ. And from the day that the wave sheaf is offered, we count from there to come to Pentecost. And in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 22 it says, "For as in Adam all die," and that we're all going to die if we're human. Hebrews 9:27. But then there's the judgment. Some are going to die and instantaneously be resurrected when Christ returns. Others are dead now and will be resurrected when Christ returns. But most will be in the second resurrection, the great white throne judgment period. "For as in Adam all die," this is verse 22, "even so in Christ all shall be made alive. But each one in his own order. Christ the first fruit," so he's the first one resurrected to immortal life because he's both human and divine. He's got a dual nature. "Afterward, those who are Christ at his coming," those who are a part of what we would call, the authentic church of God, those who are, true disciples of Jesus Christ, as the Bible defines it, they have the opportunity to be resurrected when he returns, and then to have from that point on to be immortal. human beings are not inherently immortal. We live and we die, but human beings will be resurrected, and the saints will be resurrected to immortality. I want to conclude by going to 1 Thessalonians. Of course, there's a lot of ground that I've implied without going into it at length, and over time we'll be going into these matters. But I wanted to show you these resurrections in the Bible, and maybe you can go back and look at these in greater depth on your own. But in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul comforts Christians because he says, when a saint dies, we know that it is really a sleep, because that saint's going to be resurrected when Christ returns. And in verse 16, he refers to that in 1 Thessalonians 4. 1 Thessalonians 4:16. Paul shows us, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God. We can read about this in other parts of the Bible. And the dead in Christ will rise first. So those who already are dead, then they will rise. Then we who are alive, whoever that may be, whenever that happens, those our brothers and sisters spiritually who are alive at that time. For then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them. So the death of those people will be instantaneous. In effect, they'll die and then quickly become spirit. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Now, what's the first stop? Mount of Olives. If you read Zechariah 14, Acts 1. So we're going to, meet him, and then we're going to land on the Mount of Olives with him, evidently. Verse 18 of 1 Thessalonians 4. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. So I've covered, at least in an introductory way, this doctrine of the resurrection, to show you that God has intervened in history to perform resurrections. And of course, the greatest is the greatest act of God's love is the ministry of Jesus Christ. His physical ministry, his arrest, and his betrayal and arrest and torture and crucifixion and death, and then his resurrection to mortal life. So we have a living Savior, and when he returns, his brothers and sisters spiritually will also be resurrected to immortal life to share eternity with him. And so therefore, Paul says, comfort one another with these words. All the best to you and yours.